The desert night over Utah lay silent and still. Suddenly, the station's instruments recorded absolute void, as if the world itself had stopped speaking. Beyond the dark horizon, 3 amber spheres ignited at once, hanging motionless in a perfect line. The desert of Utah stretched outward in every direction, a seemingly endless plain of sandstone ridges, salt flats, and eroded canyons that bore no trace of human life. In the summer of 1983, the United States Department of Energy authorized the temporary construction of a research outpost, a modest cluster of prefabricated modules and antenna towers that the staff simply called Station Wasteland. It was not marked on any public maps, and only 6 researchers lived there during that season. Their task was defined in vague terms as monitoring atmospheric dynamics and seismic resonance in isolated terrain, but internally the work was far more exacting. The outpost operated 24 hours a day, every moment recorded by overlapping sensors that measured wind velocity, ionization levels, radio frequencies, and subterranean vibrations. The station itself was an unimpressive sight. 3 rectangular modules of pale aluminum sat half buried in the desert sand, their roofs bristling with shortwave antennas and weather vanes. A taller mast carried a narrow radar dish that rotated slowly without sound. The interior smelled faintly of electrical insulation and desert dust, the air dry and metallic. Each room was lit by fluorescent tubes that hummed with low-voltage fatigue, giving the walls a sickly, pale sheen. The scientists kept to their routines, noting measurements, replacing paper reels on the seismic recorders, calibrating the magnetometers, and cross-checking anomalies against the control logs. The days passed with an oppressive sameness, broken only by the howling of wind across the ridges or the sharp cries of birds that disappeared as quickly as they arrived. On the evening of June 12, 1983, the desert lay in near-perfect stillness. The heat of the day had bled into the soil and the air was heavy with silence. At 23 hours and 40 minutes, the first irregularity appeared. The radio spectrum analyzer, a boxy device built in the 70s and maintained with difficulty, suddenly dropped into complete silence across the 3 to 30 MHz band. Normally the device was filled with a shifting forest of spikes and static noise, but now its line turned flat as though the atmosphere itself had been erased. The silence lasted 2 minutes and 17 seconds. The operator noted it in the log as signal suppression anomaly. Such events were rare but not entirely unknown. Ionospheric reflections could occasionally cancel themselves, though rarely across so broad a spectrum. Still, the team recorded it, printed the reel, and filed it into the growing stack of unexplained deviations. At 23 hours and 55 minutes, an additional anomaly emerged. The infrared camera mounted to the northern mast registered 3 fixed points of thermal intensity in the sky. These were not hot in the way of jet exhaust or meteor trails, but rather cold voids surrounded by faint halos of elevated heat, as though 3 bodies displaced the air and forced energy outward. Each appeared stationary, neither ascending nor drifting with the wind. The reading held for 46 seconds before vanishing. The team assumed sensor error. Instruments malfunctioned often in the desert, where sand and heat corroded delicate components. The images were filed, marked as inconclusive. Midnight came. The horizon to the west was a black ridge of stone, its edges dim under a scattered net of stars. The moon had not yet risen. At exactly 0 hours and 12 minutes, a second anomaly registered, this time visual. The operator of the western observation deck, a man trained to distrust imagination, stepped outside to calibrate the anemometer. His eyes lifted almost involuntarily, and there they were. 3 luminous spheres, each the size of a small aircraft fuselage, hung above the horizon at an estimated distance of several kilometers. They emitted no beams, no blinking lights, only a steady white glow tinged with amber. Their edges were unnaturally sharp, as if cut into the sky rather than floating within it. The air was silent, not even the faint roar of wind carried across the desert. He marked their presence in the log at 0 hours and 14 minutes. His handwriting remained steady, but he underlined the phrase synchronized disappearance, for just as suddenly as they had appeared, the spheres vanished. They did not recede into distance, nor fade as lights extinguished by fog. They simply ceased to exist, one instant there, the next instant gone. At that same moment, the radio spectrum analyzer returned to life, filling the paper strip with static peaks and valleys once again. The instruments behaved as though nothing had happened. Yet in the logbooks, the anomaly was preserved. Inside the control room, other instruments carried traces of subtle disruption. The magnetometer registered a brief spike, only a fraction of a second, but sharper than any natural fluctuation. The seismic recorder produced a tremor too shallow and too symmetrical to be geological. The humidity gauge swung upward, despite the desert air remaining dry to the skin. Each of these readings, isolated, might have been dismissed as malfunction. Together, they formed a cluster without precedent. The next morning, the team reviewed the data in silence. They spread the paper reels across the steel table, aligning the time codes with ruler and pencil. The gap of 2 minutes and 17 seconds in the radio frequencies aligned precisely with the thermal anomaly, and both coincided with the appearance of the luminous spheres. The seismic tremor overlapped as well, recorded at 0 hours and 13 minutes, mere seconds before the disappearance. The team debated quietly whether to report the event in full detail. Previous anomalies, when sent to the central office in Denver, had returned with stamped notes: equipment error, environmental noise, no action required. Yet this case involved multiple instruments, synchronized across several systems. The absence of any natural explanation disturbed them more than they admitted aloud. By the evening of June 13th, the desert once again lay in silence. The sun bled across the ridges, and shadows stretched long across the dust. The station resumed its normal rhythm. Data reels were replaced, printouts sorted, equipment recalibrated. Yet each of the 6 researchers carried the memory of those 3 hovering spheres. Their presence lingered, silent and unresolved, like the afterimage of light behind closed eyes. Station Wasteland continued its work, recording winds, seismic tremors, and invisible signals in the dry air. But from that night onward, every operator who stepped outside to check the instruments found his eyes drawn to the western horizon, waiting for the return of those silent orbs that had appeared without reason and vanished without trace. In the days that followed the first recorded appearance of the luminous spheres, Station Wasteland remained outwardly unchanged. The desert around it kept its silence, the sun rose and fell with mechanical regularity, and the staff maintained their rotation of observations, calibrations, and handwritten logs. Yet beneath the veneer of procedure, a sense of unease thickened. The 6 researchers had not spoken openly of fear, but their bodies betrayed it in small ways. They lingered longer at the instrument panels, double-checked readings before filing them, and avoided stepping outside alone after nightfall. The anomaly of June 12, 1983 had lodged itself in their minds like grit in an otherwise perfect mechanism. By June 14th, the instruments began to reveal further disturbances. At 18 hours and 53 minutes, the seismic recorders, 3 independent units installed along a triangular grid around the station, began to display abrupt oscillations. These were not the rolling curves of a minor earthquake or the faint signatures of distant blasting. Instead, the traces formed sharp vertical peaks, like teeth driven into the paper reels. Each lasted only a fraction of a second, yet they repeated with precise intervals, 5 seconds apart, for nearly 9 minutes. The impression was not of natural movement, but of a hidden machine switching on and off beneath the earth. The amplitude was uniform, the rhythm deliberate. When the traces were compared to the catalogue of known seismic patterns, no correlation could be found. The nearest recorded similarity belonged to the operation of large-scale subterranean turbines, though no such installation existed within hundreds of kilometers. The researchers marked the anomaly as seismic irregularity resembling mechanical resonance. They clipped the paper reels and sealed them in the storage cabinet, aware that the classification mechanical resonance would not be welcomed by the reviewing office in Denver. The Department of Energy preferred to attribute irregularities to soil instability or environmental feedback. Suggesting the presence of engines under the desert floor was an act of speculation verging on insubordination. Still, the log was written. The spikes could not be denied. On June 15th, a new phenomenon emerged in the physical landscape itself. At dawn, one of the staff assigned to sample soil noticed a discoloration on the broad salt flat located 2 kilometers east of the station. The pale crust of the desert floor had always been uniform, its surface fractured only by long, natural fissures. Now it bore a circle. The mark was nearly perfect, a ring of soil discolored to a duller, grayish tone, 40 meters in diameter. The circumference was clean, without irregularities, as if drawn with a compass on an enormous scale. Viewed from the ridge above, the circle resembled an imprint, a negative impression of something vast that had pressed against the ground from above. Yet the soil was not burned or charred. Instead, it was compacted, the crust hardened as though under immense pressure, but without any trace of heat. Samples were taken. The hardened layer extended 12 centimeters below the surface, unusually deep for natural compaction in salt flats. Laboratory analysis revealed no chemical contamination, no petroleum residue, no ash, only compression. The circle seemed less like a burn and more like a footprint, pressed into the land by something heavy and deliberate. The researchers debated whether to photograph the site. In the end, 3 rolls of film were used, each from a different camera, the images carefully stored alongside the seismic reels. That same night, another anomaly unfolded. The desert sky was unusually clear, the Milky Way visible in sharp relief across the heavens. At 22 hours and 11 minutes, a shadow crossed the stars. The operator of the observation deck first assumed it to be a passing aircraft, but the shape was wrong. The object revealed itself as a diamond, elongated along its vertical axis, its edges sharply defined against the sky. It made no sound, no hum of engines or sweep of rotor blades. It drifted directly over the station, blotting out the stars as it passed. The darkness of the object was absolute. Unlike clouds, which refract starlight, this shape consumed it, rendering the sky behind it invisible. The researchers measured its passage at 27 seconds from horizon to horizon. If its altitude was similar to that of commercial aircraft, its size would have exceeded 100 meters in length. If lower, the dimensions became even more daunting. The object carried no lights, emitted no heat signature detectable on the infrared sensors, and produced no radar return on the short-range dish. It was visible only to the eye and to the absence it carved into the stars. The seismic recorders, still active, noted faint oscillations during the object's passage, not unlike those observed 2 days earlier. The radio spectrum analyzer, however, did something more peculiar. At the precise moment the diamond crossed overhead, the instrument flatlined once again. Every frequency from 1 to 30 megahertz fell into silence, a perfect horizontal line stretching across the printout. After exactly 1 minute, the static returned, as if nothing had occurred. Inside the control module, the fluorescent lights dimmed briefly during the object's transit. The drop in voltage was subtle, but noticeable enough to cause instruments to flicker. Afterward, the power supply stabilized. Yet the memory of the sudden shadow above, silent and immense, lingered. The following morning, the researchers returned to the salt flat. The circular impression remained, unchanged, though it now carried subtle striations along its interior. Fine lines crossed the hardened soil, radiating outward from the center, as though the ground had been pressed by a grid or lattice. These striations had not been visible the previous day. No explanation presented itself. The soil remained cold to the touch, the lines too precise to be caused by wind erosion. The circle now looked less like a natural anomaly and more like the deliberate imprint of an object that had settled upon the earth, then risen again. Each development eroded the fragile barrier between routine and intrusion. The purpose of Station Wasteland had been to study weather patterns and seismic fluctuations, yet now the instruments behaved as if tuned to an unseen intelligence. Every anomaly occurred at night, every anomaly coincided with silence on the radio spectrum, and every anomaly left behind only fragments of evidence, enough to be undeniable but insufficient to be explained. The desert itself seemed altered. Animals that occasionally strayed near the station, rabbits, coyotes, small birds, grew scarce. Their tracks, once common along the salt flat, vanished. The air at night felt heavier, the silence thicker, as though sound itself hesitated to travel. Even the researchers began to feel changes in their perception. They described in their private notes the sensation of being observed when standing outdoors, a pressure behind the eyes, a quickening of pulse without cause. The sensation lasted only moments, but it was repeated often enough to be noted across 4 independent journals. By June 17th, the data cabinets of Station Wasteland were filled with reels and photographs documenting these irregularities. Yet none of it could be explained. The circle on the salt flat remained visible from the ridges, an enduring reminder of presence. The seismic peaks returned each night in bursts of mechanical regularity, and overhead, the memory of the black diamond crossing silently through the stars persisted, as if etched into the minds of all who had seen it. Station Wasteland continued its operations, but the word routine no longer applied. The desert had revealed its silence to be not emptiness but waiting, and what pressed upon it from above or below had begun to show itself in unmistakable forms. The decision to move beyond the perimeter of Station Wasteland was not made lightly. By the 19th of June, 1983, the accumulation of anomalies had rendered routine data collection meaningless. The staff understood that instruments alone could not explain the silence of the radios, the peaks of the seismic recorders, or the geometric imprint pressed into the salt flat. The evidence pointed outward, away from the controlled confines of the facility, towards something older and less accounted for in the barren desert that stretched for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. It was decided that 3 members of the group would depart on foot, following a line of abandoned service roads leading southward toward a known site of decommissioned military testing grounds, dormant since the early 1960s. The path to the range was harsh. The desert floor alternated between hard clay crust and soft dunes of loose grit that swallowed boots with every step. The June heat was unrelenting, and yet the travelers recorded in their notes that the air carried an odd undercurrent of chill even beneath the sun. Each hour, they paused to recalibrate their portable sensors. The instruments revealed familiar patterns until mid-afternoon, when a gradual decline in ambient radio noise began to manifest. By 1500 hours, the spectrum analyzer was registering an unprecedented silence. Frequencies that should have been alive with distant broadcasts, static, and atmospheric hiss collapsed into a narrow band of flatline. The landscape itself provided the first clue that they were drawing near. Rising from the desert floor like skeletal remains, the reinforced concrete shells of old bunkers appeared, their surfaces fractured and crumbling beneath decades of erosion. Rusted barbed wire still coiled around leaning fence posts, but the gates themselves had long since fallen to dust. Signage was absent, though faint outlines of painted warnings remained visible in certain light, ghostly shapes of stenciled letters once declaring restricted access. No formal record had mentioned continued use of the site after 1962, yet its very neglect gave it the appearance of deliberate burial, as if abandonment had been staged. Among the ruins stood a structure of unusual form. It was not a bunker or a storage shed, but a rectangular slab of reinforced concrete with a central opening partially collapsed inward. A shaft descended from within, lined with twisted remains of metal cladding that had peeled away over time. It was here that the instruments began to behave in ways that defied expectation. The portable spectrum unit fell completely silent. Every band above 1 MHz showed nothing but unbroken flatline. The geophones, placed at the edge of the shaft, failed to detect even the faint echoes of wind or settling debris. And most disturbing of all, when the researchers spoke or clapped their hands near the mouth of the shaft, the sound diminished unnaturally. Vibrations seemed to die in the air itself, swallowed before they could rebound against the concrete walls. The shaft was deep, though the exact depth could not be measured with the tools at hand. A weighted cord lowered into the darkness extended beyond 30 meters without striking bottom. Illumination was attempted. A hand lamp was suspended by rope and lowered slowly into the opening. At approximately 35 meters, the light encountered reflection. Not the dull glimmer of wet rock or fractured quartz, but a cold metallic sheen, perfectly smooth and unbroken, as if a vast surface of polished alloy lay beneath the crumbling shaft. The lamp's beam split into 2 distinct arcs, bouncing upward in symmetrical glare. Photographs were taken, though the results showed little beyond the pale flare of artificial light against a dark background. The air temperature around the shaft dropped by 4 degrees Celsius during the descent experiment. The portable magnetometer registered violent swings, spiking upward to readings that exceeded the scale of the device, then falling back to 0 without gradual transition. Each spike coincided with brief distortions in the photographic equipment. Images captured during these intervals showed streaks of light, blurred lines across the film, inconsistent with operator error or mechanical fault. As evening fell, the 3 researchers established a temporary observation point near the shaft. They recorded barometric pressure, infrared emissions, and atmospheric ionization levels, all of which displayed irregular shifts. But the most extraordinary development occurred not within the shaft, but above it. At 19 hours and 42 minutes, the first luminous sphere appeared on the horizon. Its glow was amber white, not dazzling, but distinct against the deepening sky. Within moments, 4 others emerged, drifting into view from separate points of the desert horizon until 5 in total had gathered. The formation they assumed was deliberate. 3 aligned into a triangular shape, while 2 hung symmetrically above, forming a pattern reminiscent of geometric overlays used in navigational plotting. The spheres maintained perfect station-keeping. They did not waver in wind, nor shift in brightness, nor alter in altitude. Their dimensions, estimated by angular measurement, suggested diameters of 10 to 12 meters each. For nearly 3 hours, the formation remained motionless above the ruins. During this time, the instruments on the ground behaved erratically. The magnetometer oscillated violently, its needle swinging from one extreme to the other every few seconds. Portable radiation counters ticked irregularly, producing short bursts of elevated counts without sustained exposure. Even the analog watches worn by the researchers began to falter, their second hands stuttering as if held in invisible resistance. The silence of the desert deepened. Coyotes that often prowled the range at dusk did not appear. The usual drone of insects was absent. The 3 researchers noted in their journals that it felt as though the very atmosphere had become suspended, every natural process suppressed or paused. The spheres themselves gave off no sound, no exhaust, no visible propulsion. Their glow was steady, neither pulsating nor flickering, and yet their presence was overwhelming. The sky around them seemed subtly distorted, the stars behind their outlines shimmering faintly as though viewed through heated air. At 22 hours precisely, the formation dispersed. Not in gradual flight, but in simultaneous vanishing. All 5 spheres blinked out in the same instant, leaving only the empty night sky. The magnetometer fell silent. The radiation counters steadied, the air temperature returned to its previous reading. Only the shaft remained, swallowing sound and reflecting the faintest glimmer of light from its hidden surface below. The 3 researchers, exhausted and unsettled, recorded their final measurements before making the return trek. They carried with them the reels of seismic data, the rolls of film, and the notes of their observations, all of which pointed to the same conclusion. The desert was not empty, and beneath its surface lay something vast, deliberate, and responsive. Above, the spheres had lingered in patient stillness, as though acknowledging the attention directed into the shaft. The desert closed in around the site once more, silent and indifferent, yet forever marked by what had been revealed. The shaft was not merely a ruin, and the spheres were not merely lights. Together they formed a system of presence and response, inscrutable and unrecorded in any official archive. Station Wasteland would receive the data the next morning, but the meaning of what had been witnessed would remain unresolved. The descent expedition had returned alive, but it had brought with it more questions than answers, and the desert seemed to withhold its explanations as deliberately as it revealed its signs. By the morning of June 20th, 1983, the desert no longer resembled an inert landscape. The first signs came with the dawn shift, when the monitoring station's locators began to register dozens of discrete contacts in the upper atmosphere. The signals were not consistent with conventional aircraft. They appeared suddenly, without approach, and vanished just as quickly, leaving no transitional traces. At times, the screens displayed as many as 30 returns at once, scattered across the sky like a constellation of artificial stars. Within seconds, the display would collapse back to emptiness, only to reappear moments later in a different pattern. Visually, the observers on the ground confirmed that the sky itself had begun to carry signs. At first, they mistook them for ordinary atmospheric phenomena, pale glimmers near the horizon, reflections of early sunlight on high ice crystals. But the lights shifted in ways no natural source could sustain. They flared into sudden brilliance and then dimmed, leaving behind silhouettes too defined to be clouds. The forms were white, geometric, and silent. Some hung in the air like angular slats, others flickered like blades cutting through the atmosphere. None resembled satellites, aircraft, or meteorological balloons. Their sudden appearance above an otherwise clear desert sky pushed every rational category into collapse. The video cameras trained on the salt flats, and the horizon recorded their own anomalies. Replayed frame by frame, the tapes showed streaks of vertical light, narrow columns descending straight downward from the upper atmosphere to the desert floor. These luminous shafts were not visible to the naked eye in real time. Only on playback did they reveal themselves, glowing with the sharpness of welding arcs, cutting through the image with unnatural precision. At times, multiple columns appeared in parallel, aligned as though they formed part of a structured grid invisible to human perception. The observers debated whether they had been captured due to some quirk of the camera lenses, but every angle and every device produced the same result. By mid-morning, the physiological toll began to emerge. One of the younger staff members, stationed near the monitoring consoles, reported an intense ringing in both ears. The sensation built over minutes into a punishing frequency, enough to disrupt balance and induce nausea. Within the hour, he suffered a sudden nosebleed, blood running freely without prior injury. He was removed from the consoles and placed in a side room, though his symptoms continued intermittently throughout the day. Others noted lesser but similar effects: brief dizziness, headaches, and an unusual sensation of pressure, as though the air itself were compressing against the skull. At the outer perimeter of the salt flat, new phenomena emerged. A luminous dome began to form along the southern boundary, first as a faint distortion in the morning haze, and then as a visible hemisphere of glowing air. It shimmered faintly, amber-white, not unlike heat rising from asphalt, but brighter and more defined. The dome expanded outward until it spanned more than 50 meters across, resting directly upon the salt crust. Observers reported that its surface seemed semi-permeable, like mist encased in glass. The instruments registered a strong rise in ionization levels around the dome, with counters clicking at irregular but elevated rates. Within minutes, a column of amber light erupted from the center of the dome. It extended upward in a solid beam, cutting through the desert atmosphere and disappearing into the high stratosphere. Unlike a spotlight, it emitted no diffusion, no spread of photons into the air. Its edges were sharply defined, a pillar of radiance without visible source. The column persisted for nearly 4 minutes. During that time, seismic recorders beneath the dome site captured oscillations reminiscent of a heavy engine activating deep underground. The pattern was rhythmic, rising and falling with intervals of approximately 11 seconds. When the beam retracted, silence followed. The dome dimmed, then pulsed once more. From its core, a shadow began to rise. At first it appeared as an indistinct mass, darker than the surrounding desert air. Gradually edges clarified into structure, an immense triangular form lifting slowly from the ground. Its base stretched wide, spanning at least 100 meters from tip to tip, and its surface reflected no light, absorbing every trace of sun that touched it. The triangular craft rose with absolute silence, no exhaust, no tremor of displaced air. Beneath its base, faint luminous points glowed, arranged in a pattern of 3 equidistant lights, forming their own triangle within the larger geometry. The structure ascended until it cleared the dome entirely, which then collapsed like vapor dissipating. Observers noted that the craft seemed both vast and weightless. It moved with the stillness of a shadow separating from the earth, unaffected by wind or resistance. The instruments confirmed a sharp magnetic anomaly during its ascent, with flux readings oscillating violently before stabilizing as the object reached higher altitude. For nearly 12 minutes, the triangular form hovered above the salt flat. Its presence blocked the stars still faintly visible in the morning sky, creating a void of darkness in the firmament. Some on the ground described a sensation of being observed, though no visible apertures or sensors were apparent on the structure's surface. At regular intervals, thin beams of white light descended from the underside of the craft, touching the ground in silent contact. Each beam left behind a faint circular mark on the salt crust, no larger than a meter across, glowing briefly before fading. The psychological weight grew heavier with every passing minute. The staff, though trained in detached observation, wrote in their journals of a pressure that went beyond sound or weight. It was as if the triangular presence imposed itself not only upon the desert but upon thought itself. Concentration faltered, hands shook. Notes became erratic, filled with unfinished sentences and repeated words. The sense of time distorted, minutes stretching into what felt like hours as the immense form lingered above. At precisely 11 hours and 27 minutes, the triangular craft ascended further, accelerating without transition. One moment it hovered, the next it had surged upward at impossible velocity, leaving no contrail, no sonic boom, no disturbance of the desert air. The sky closed behind it, empty once again, leaving only the marks on the salt crust and the echoes recorded by machines. The aftermath was one of exhaustion and dread. Instruments had been pushed beyond their limits, registering data in ranges they were not built to measure. Personnel remained shaken, one still suffering intermittent bleeding and auditory pain. The desert, so often a place of silence and stillness, now carried the memory of intervention, of a presence vast enough to alter not only physical measures, but the very sense of reality among those who watched. The phenomenon was filed in the logbooks without explanation. No ordinary category could contain what had occurred. It was clear only that observation had escalated into intervention, and that whatever intelligence guided the event had chosen that morning to reveal both control and indifference. The desert was no longer a passive backdrop. It had become a stage for incursions that human instruments could barely capture and human perception could not withstand. The silence fell without warning. At 19 hours and 42 minutes, all outgoing transmissions from the desert station ceased. The cutoff was not gradual. One moment the telemetry streamed across the monitoring screens in Salt Lake City. The next it collapsed into a uniform signal with no variance, a flat line of data as though the instruments themselves had entered a state of suspended animation. Red indicators blinked to confirm that the channels were still open, yet nothing moved across them. The final recordings, when examined later, captured a sequence unlike anything that had been logged before. The fixed exterior cameras, positioned on tall masts to survey the perimeter, showed the desert floor vanishing beneath a massive shadow. The source was not a storm front or passing cloud. It was a vast object descending until it filled the entire field of vision. Its surface revealed nothing, no rivets, no markings, no reflection of moonlight. It was darkness made solid, blocking the horizon, obliterating every familiar contour of sky. Around this immense silhouette, secondary forms appeared. They were luminous spheres, smaller than the primary structure but equally unsettling. Each sphere glowed with a dull white corona, neither brilliant nor weak, and together they traced an orbit around the larger mass. The motion was deliberate, maintaining precise equidistant spacing. Within minutes, the formation resembled a crown, a rotating halo encircling the central void. The microphones captured sound, but it was not the sound of life. A low-frequency resonance emerged, pulsing in steady intervals, vibrating through the air with the density of ocean waves. It bore no resemblance to engines or machinery. It was more akin to geological tremors, a voice of the earth that had been shifted upward into the range of hearing. At certain frequencies, the tone became almost inaudible to the human ear, but the recording needles shook violently, registering power beyond their calibration. There were no cries. No rush of footsteps, no doors slamming. The station's interior remained absent of human presence in both sound and movement. In the final 30 seconds of recording, one camera within the central hall captured a faint distortion, a shimmer across the air as though the room itself were being pulled sideways. Furniture vibrated slightly. A loose sheet of paper lifted from a desk and then settled again. Beyond that, there was nothing. By dawn of June 21st, a small emergency relief convoy, dispatched after repeated failed attempts to raise the station, reached the site. They expected malfunction, perhaps a collapsed generator or damaged antenna array. Instead, they found emptiness. The first detail noticed was the state of the doors. Every entry was unlatched, some wide open to the desert wind. Yet none showed signs of forced entry. Hinges were intact, locks unbroken. Inside, the station appeared preserved mid-motion, as though the staff had simply stood up and left in silence. Meals were still laid out upon metal trays in the mess hall, untouched and cooling in place. Cups half filled with coffee had grown a thin skin of oil on their surface, but the liquid inside remained warm enough to suggest that only hours had passed since they were poured. The instruments remained active. The humming of servers and the rhythmic sweep of oscillographs continued as if nothing had occurred. Monitors glowed with frozen graphs. The telemetry rolls inside the recorders stretched into long uniform lines of unbroken signal. No spikes, no anomalies, only perfect stillness. Personal belongings remained scattered naturally throughout the facility. Coats hung neatly by the entrance. Notebooks sat open at desks with pens resting on unfinished sentences. A wristwatch ticked steadily on a nightstand beside an empty bunk. No item suggested panic. No overturned chairs, no broken glass, no signs of hurried departure. The absence of struggle was total. The rescue personnel conducted a perimeter sweep. The desert offered no clues. No footprints led away from the station. No tire tracks marked the salt crust. The ground was pristine except for faint impressions near the northern edge of the compound. These impressions formed circles, shallow depressions in the soil approximately 3 meters wide, spaced at intervals around the facility. Their geometry mirrored the arrangement of spheres seen in the final video transmission, as though the orbs had lowered themselves to the Earth in silent contact. Radiation counters swept over the impressions revealed nothing outside of natural background levels. Magnetometers, however, displayed erratic deflections, brief surges that dissipated as quickly as they appeared, like echoes of a field no longer present. The air smelled faintly metallic, a tang impossible to attribute to machinery or environment. The convoy leader ordered every building inspected. The laboratories were immaculate, samples remained labeled and ordered, glass vials aligned on racks. Refrigeration units hummed softly with preserved contents. The communications room, normally alive with chatter and data bursts, was hushed except for the mechanical whir of recording equipment. The bunks were empty, sheets turned back as though the occupants had risen only moments before departure. The search stretched into the afternoon, but nothing more was discovered. No bodies, no traces of exit, no signals of distress. The 6 members of the research group had vanished as if absorbed by the silence itself. As the team prepared to withdraw, one final anomaly was noted. In the storage annex, among rows of geological equipment, a small portable recorder was found running. Unlike the main consoles, this device had captured a continuous audio stream through the night. When played back, it revealed only the same bass resonance heard in the official logs, punctuated by silence. Yet in the final minutes, a brief fluctuation occurred. The tone shifted upward into a higher harmonic, and for 2 seconds the recorder emitted a sound that resembled breathing, slow, steady, and not human. No explanation was entered into the logbooks. The station was left operational, its machines continuing to run, but no staff remained to watch them. Reports filed later reduced the matter to total personnel loss, cause undetermined. The desert reclaimed its quiet, leaving behind a facility intact but emptied of life, a hollow shell preserved with the precision of a photograph. The disappearance was absolute. Only the long unbroken lines of the instrument rolls remained as testimony, straight marks across white paper, symbols of continuity that masked the void where 6 lives had been. 1 week after the final transmission, the official communiqué was released. The wording was brief, detached, and clinical. It stated that during routine operations in the Utah desert, the research group had succumbed to environmental hazards. The explanation described a desert accident, attributing the loss of personnel to extreme exposure, equipment malfunction, and potential disorientation. No mention was made of the transmissions, the objects in the sky, or the silent abandonment of the station. To the public record, the incident was closed, but behind closed doors, the file did not end with that declaration. In the restricted archives of a federal repository in Washington, D.C., a separate folder was created under the classification level reserved for incidents of strategic interest. Within it, the surviving records of the station were assembled with meticulous care. Photographs formed the first section. These images, recovered from both automated cameras and the portable devices of the research staff, displayed luminous anomalies above the salt flats. The most striking frames showed multiple orbs suspended in precise formation, their glow faint but distinctly separate from natural stars. The spheres appeared identical in size, arranged at exact intervals that suggested geometric intent. Several images captured the central shadow, the immense triangular void that had hovered above the station. In these photographs, the outline was faint, almost indistinguishable from the night, but the absence of starlight behind it made its presence undeniable. The second section contained instrument logs. Magnetometer charts displayed violent surges recorded at the exact window of disappearance. The spikes rose with mathematical symmetry, some reaching levels beyond the instrument's calibration. Oscillographs showed disruptions resembling harmonic waves, a layered resonance that did not match seismic or atmospheric events. The lines converged into patterns that analysts later described as artificial interference, not random noise. Handwritten notes from the emergency relief team were preserved, though heavily redacted. Margins contained hurried observations, doors open, meals untouched, flat signal across all devices, and unexplained impressions around perimeter. One entry dated June 22nd referenced visual similarity to previous classified cases. The handwriting was neat, but the sentence was partially erased, leaving only fragments visible. Beyond this, the report shifted abruptly. Several pages had been cut from the binding, their absence noted with numbered placeholders. Between the missing sections, one paragraph survived with minimal redaction. It read, "Visual presence of multiple unidentified aerial objects confirmed. Further observation deemed inadvisable. Containment procedures recommended. No escalation required. The next surviving entry was a type directive from the Department of Energy in coordination with the Air Force. It authorized immediate closure of the research site. The shaft discovered near the abandoned military proving ground was ordered to be sealed with concrete infill. The surrounding perimeter was fenced with barbed wire and posted with signs declaring restricted federal property. The station itself was dismantled piece by piece, its instruments removed, its power systems disconnected. By the end of July 1984, only a skeletal frame of foundations and scattered debris remained, lost in the silence of the desert. The file also included satellite reconnaissance images. These frames were taken years after the disappearance, long after the site had been declared dormant. Despite the supposed emptiness, anomalies persisted. On 3 separate occasions, the orbital sensors recorded brief flashes of light originating from the same coordinates as the sealed shaft. The flashes were not meteorological. They registered as concentrated bursts, lasting less than 1 second each, with intensity sufficient to saturate the detectors. The annotations beneath the images labeled them unexplained energy events. Internal memoranda revealed disagreement among analysts. Some argued that the flashes were likely sensor malfunctions, artifacts caused by cosmic radiation or reflection anomalies. Others noted that the precision of the coordinates across years of separation argued against random error. A summary by one intelligence officer stated, "Pattern recurrence cannot be dismissed as coincidence." Correlation with previous events remains unresolved. The archive contained no further action plans. No task force was assigned, no follow-up expeditions ordered. The language of the documents shifted toward dismissal. Terms such as non-critical phenomena, non-hostile anomalies, and beyond current operational interest appeared repeatedly. The phrase, "no escalation," was underlined in several directives, echoing a pattern of bureaucratic retreat familiar to anyone who had traced similar cases across the Cold War years. For those with clearance to view the sealed report, the conclusion was unsettling in its silence. It suggested not ignorance but resignation, as if those responsible had decided that certain mysteries were better left untouched. The final page bore no analysis, only a procedural stamp. File closed, observation suspended, yet the land itself resisted closure. Local pilots reported faint glows above the salt flats during long-haul flights. Amateur radio operators in the surrounding counties noted episodes of sudden static, concentrated on the same frequencies that the station had once monitored. On certain nights, satellite feeds leaked into civilian weather databases, displaying momentary blooms of light over coordinates that had long since been erased from maps. In time, the sealed report became another fragment in a growing collection of incidents relegated to the margins of history. Officially, 6 researchers had been lost to an accident in the desert. Unofficially, the evidence suggested an encounter with something unclassified, deliberate, and enduring. The shaft was buried, the site abandoned, the access denied. Yet the sky above Utah did not forget. The flashes continued, faint and intermittent, visible only to those who searched for them in silence. And somewhere in the locked drawers of the archive, the missing pages of the report remained, cut from their binding, waiting in obscurity.